Awakened Living is a 21st century movement for people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious, who have a deep hunger for connected community and a divine impulse for personal and global transformation. Our mission is to encourage and inspire the awakening of human consciousness. Good evening. Welcome to Awakened Living Television. My name is TJ Woodward. I'm the minister and spiritual director of Awakened Living in San Francisco. I'm also the host of Awakened Living Television. Awakened Living Television started about 3 years ago when I had a desire to be in conversation about 21st century spirituality. And if the word spiritual doesn't work, it could be living your best life, living your most fulfilled life. And what about just happiness? So I am really excited that this evening we have Kim Kokoska on the show. She and I are colleagues. I had the privilege of working with Kim at a treatment center and working intimately with her with clients, and I am so grateful she's here. One of my favorite people to be in conversation with about therapy, about psychology, and in particular about spirituality as it relates to the process of therapy and psychology. I'm going to let her talk more about that, but I'm introducing the topic. What we're going to be talking about this evening is spiritual psychology, and what is it, and maybe how it's different than traditional psychology. So Kim, welcome to the show.
Thanks, TJ.
I'm so grateful you're here. I really am. You are one of my favorite people to be in conversation with, and I feel like whether it's 15 minutes or 2 hours, I feel like there's always more for us to say. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too.
Before we do that, though, why don't you take a couple minutes to just tell people a little bit about yourself, our viewers.
Okay, great. So my name's Kim Kokoska. I'm a marriage and family therapist, psychotherapist, practicing. I have a private practice here in San Francisco. My specialty is really looking at therapy through the lens of spiritual psychology. I was educated at the University of Santa Monica, where we focused on spiritual psychology.
Well, great. Well, and I know, and transpersonal psychology,
Yeah.
Is that another way to say it, or is that different?
No, that's different.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I would love to begin by exploring what the difference between spiritual psychology and traditional psychology is.
Sure. So when we look at the term psychology, the ology is really the study of. And the first part of that is the psyche. The psyche originally referenced the soul, the breath, the sort of essence of beingness. Over time, psychology is now defined as the science of mind and behavior. So we've left the spirit, the soul, the life force out of the psychology in its more traditional, currently defined sense.
Wow, and I know you and I do such similar work, and it's really about looking at what's underlying this. And I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about, because you and I know we've talked a lot about this, that it is also very valuable, what we call traditional psychology.
Absolutely.
But when someone comes to you, and we can talk about it through the lens of addiction or a relationship issue, maybe they want to create a more dynamic life. What are some of the ways that you get to what's underneath, or maybe what's kind of the motivation or what's driving the bus?
Well, let me back it up just a little bit to talk about what we mean by spiritual psychology, because really it's a point of view, it's an attitude that we approach the work from that really is the juice behind the work. So we can be doing the exact same processes, but depending on how we're looking at the process that we're going through, the experience that we're going through, it's going to impact the effectiveness of the process. So from a spiritual psychological standpoint, we're looking at our experience here on earth really as a way for our soul to heal. And that we came onto the planet with a very particular curriculum designed individually for us through our experience here on the earth planet, as we call it. And each of the experiences that we're having that cause any upset for us are an indicator that's an opportunity for our soul to heal. So it takes, yes, I want to feel better, and puts it in a little bit of a bigger light so that we can recognize that we're more than just this experience that we're having, that this experience is here to remind us that we are more than that.
Wow, and that to me is such a fundamental piece, that when I begin to recognize that there's not something wrong with the situation, but something that's asking for some attention, or we could even say something right with it, although that, maybe not, but that there's something there valuable that our soul is seeking wholeness, seeking healing. So, wow, that alone changes the paradigm dramatically.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I like the way that you phrased, we could say something right about it, sort of in the grand scheme of rightness, that from this point of view, there is only rightness.
Yeah.
That each circumstance is uniquely presented for us. So it can only be right. So it takes us out of the right-wrong paradigm, which is where the suffering comes from.
Thank you. It's so funny. That's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say that suffering. Suffering is me wanting something outside of myself to change in order for me to be okay.
Absolutely.
And the only way I can assume that is if I think there's something wrong with it.
Absolutely.
So, wow, there's a couple different directions here. One is, what happens when a person comes to you and doesn't get that yet? Like they really are still in the rightness and wrongness. How do you work with that? Let's maybe start there.
Sure. That's a great question. And the majority of people, I think, are having that experience. Yeah. So what we look at is, okay, are you having an experience that's upsetting to you? And if so, let's look at what it is about that experience that's upsetting you. And what we will recognize is that generally, if there's an experience that's upsetting us, it's because we have some idea, belief, paradigm, structure about how that situation should be. And when it's not matching up, then that causes us pain and suffering. So really, that paradigm helps us move into a place, but it's not necessary at all. We can still continue to work with whatever the experience is, whether or not we believe or don't believe in this idea of spiritual psychology. It just helps ease the process in some way.
Wow, I love that, because wherever I'm at, I can access this process regardless.
Absolutely.
I'm reminded of a couple of things. One is nothing's more painful than 99% surrender. And in my own story, when I either currently, there's still times where I know all of this intellectually, but there's that trigger that happens. And I had something very recently, and of course, I came to you, and you, of course, very gently and lovingly said, well, we know it's not about the situation. And I love that as just a very basic framework. So then it invites me to be accountable.
Yes.
Yeah, and so if we could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I guess the fundamental key, and we've heard this before, is we are responsible. The key to our freedom is to genuinely take full responsibility for our own actions and responses. Responsibility means the ability to respond. And it's not even so much about how we're responding, it's on a whole deeper level, how we're responding to ourselves in the way in which we are responding.
Wow. Yeah, and when you were talking, I was thinking it's not so much about how I respond, but where I'm responding from. Like, what,
And then we can trace that feeling to the place where the decisions were made about this particular situation based on an earlier experience, which is what happens. We come in, and if we're going to look at it from the possibility of this spiritual psychology perspective, we come in with a curriculum, some areas that our particular soul has to heal. And we experience, the experiences that we have are designed to help us clear those areas. And so we will call in experiences that we will then make decisions about.
Totally.
Then those decisions we make, we hold on to for the rest of our lives potentially. That then determine how we will respond in similar situations because of some decision we made as a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old.
I love that. I do. And that's like so fundamental to me, to like my intention for the work I do is, can I get back to that? And I remember at one point, some people offering me some feedback about decision. They're like, well, a 6-year-old cannot make a decision with that kind of gravity. And yet it was my experience. I remember very clearly thinking the world wasn't safe. And then as I made that fundamental decision, then of course the world wasn't safe. Yeah. And so for me, the spiritual journey, or the journey in a therapeutic setting, is really so much about unlearning, or at least getting to that moment where that decision was made.
And interestingly, we don't actually have to get there.
Yeah. Okay.
We may or may not be able to trace back where that decision was made. Sometimes it's helpful because it helps us understand why we believe what we believe, but really is all we need to know is what we believe.
Yeah.
And whether or not that belief is continuing to serve us.
Yes.
And if it's not, we have an opportunity to potentially restructure that belief.
Indeed. And I'll tell you, like, very simply, nothing changes if nothing changes. And when I recognize that, then for me, I begin to question everything. Where did I get this idea? Where did, and I hear you don't have to know where it came from, but like I recognize I've been walking around with it. So
Exactly.
Of course, that's what's showing up in my life. So I want to switch gears a little, because another one of my favorite topics with you is addiction.
Yeah.
You and I both work with people in recovery from addiction, or quite frankly, in the middle of one.
Yeah.
And I know that I personally have no judgment about where someone is on that. If they want to let go of the addiction, of course, I would love to serve them. But I love talking about addiction with you, and I'm wondering if you would be willing to just kind of give a framework for how you see what addiction is. Yeah.
So from my point of view, the way I conceptualize addiction is any time we're depending on something external to help manage a discomfort an internal discomfort. So it can be anything from substances, which is what we specifically worked with. It can be sex, it can be shopping, it can be caffeine, it can be partnership, it can be words with friends, it can be the internet, on and on and on. It's anything that we're using to external to try to soothe something internal. It happens that drugs have a very powerful effect on our internal state, on our mood. So they tend to be one that draw us most. So the beauty, and I in the work that we've done and the folks we've gotten to work with, this becomes the springboard into an awakened life, into recovery. Really is about transformation. And we have seen the folks we work with transform with such speed, because what they're wrapped in, it's big, and it's reflecting that there's something big happening. So when they take that, they stop and say, okay, I want to look at this, the transformation can happen. The interesting part is when we do look at this model of change, and we look at it from a spiritual perspective, we've got multiple levels that we're working on. We have the physical level, we have the mental level, we have the emotional level, we have the spiritual level. When we're in the top 3, that's our physical world reality. That's our ego area. There's a duality there. There's the positive and there's the negative. There's the things we like, there's the things we don't like. When we get down onto the authentic level, that sort of disappears. When we're working in recovery, when someone gets sober, they make a physical decision to stop using whatever substance there is. So they're going to move along on that physical line, but there's work to be done below on the mental and the emotional levels, and then ultimately on the spiritual level to contain and move out of that paradigm, that right and wrong, that duality, into a greater sense of spirit and self.
Wow, and that so beautifully said. Because that really speaks to what I know that I'm here to do, and I know what you're here to do. And that, one thing that stands out for me in that conversation is there's so much focus in the recovery movement and in therapy on that level, that physical level, the mental, the emotional, and the physical, that, you know, and it's very, very useful.
Absolutely.
Very, very useful. And one could say important and
Absolutely.
needed. And there's this underlying, you know, maybe we could call it the causative effect. What's driving the bus is the way I put it. Yeah. So how do we, when someone has that moment where they're ready to make a change on the physical level, put down an addiction, maybe they've gone through a divorce, maybe they've just had a baby, something in their physical realm really changes, and then there's this desire or this yearning for something deeper. How do we work with that? How does that show up for you?
Well, we look at the experience the person has now that they've put that down. So I put down the addiction, now I'm back into my life. What's happening in my life? And noticing when I get tempted to pick that back up again. And that's our point of entry. Now we know that there's something discomfort, there's an upset internally that's happening. Now we get to work with that. We get to look at whatever the judgments are, the way we've somehow separated ourselves from our experience, that in this case the substance helped us somehow feel connected again, which it didn't actually do, that somehow made us feel like we were having some sense of control in our outside world to manage our inside world, which really wasn't getting managed. So now that's really where the real work begins.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's an exciting time. And
there's an and.
And the work can still happen if the addiction hasn't been put down. Absolutely, because who am I to decide which needs to come first? I know that, you know, traditionally, if someone is willing to you know, put a stop, if you will, to the addiction, what shows up is so valuable. And I'm reminded through the lens of spiritual psychology or through spirituality, that's where there's so much opportunity, because in my experience, that has such a numbing effect. And of course, that's usually why people are addicted. Because it's making me not feel better, but feel less. Feel less, And so there's the opportunity that comes up when the addiction gets put down. And it's a statement. It's a level of intention, clarity of intention. And healing can still happen as we're moving towards that possible decision.
Absolutely. So I'm wondering, maybe a little bit of gear switching, because I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share a little bit about how your path led you, either through your education or your life experience, led you through and to spiritual psychology as a specialty and or
as an orientation is the way I would phrase it.
Yeah, I love that.
I think for me, you know, I grew up a very physical kid. I was a very athletic kid, and I depended a lot on my physicality to make my stance in the world, who I was. And when I was 18, I fell asleep behind the wheel of a brand new truck that I'd gotten for my graduation, and I rolled off the side of a mountain. I broke my neck, and I was paralyzed temporarily from the waist down. And through that experience, my ideas of who I was, why I was here, how I defined myself, got a little flipped. I went through a transformative period at that time, but then kind of forgot about it. And then went to college and was really in a success-oriented, materialistically driven lifestyle. And I wasn't happy. And I kept thinking, there's more. There's more to being here. I'm here for more. I am more. And how can I access that? And so I started moving in the direction of psychology, but traditional psychology wasn't touching that place that I yearned to explore. And so that's when I made the decision to go to University of Santa Monica.
Wow, I'm not surprised one more time in the similarities in our path, because I feel like I had kind of early in my early 20s a spiritual awakening of sorts, and an introduction to like Eastern spiritual thought and a sense of deep spirituality, and then a little bit of I'm going to leave that behind for now because I want to succeed materially. And then for me, like that it just wasn't working. It just wasn't working. And through the lens that we've been discussing, it was absolutely working perfectly.
Yeah.
It was that
Absolutely.
completely
Yes.
working perfectly, because it was in that dissatisfaction with the material world, or the way I was treating the material world, really the way I was addicted to it.
Absolutely.
Looking for something outside of myself to fix something.
Yep.
And first of all, we're not even broken. So nothing needs to be fixed. And isn't that beautiful to know?
Yeah, and I think this is a process of remembering that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like we don't measure spirituality by how loving we are. We measure spirituality by how much we recognize that we are loving.
Yeah, and that we're love.
And that we are love.
Yeah. And I love that. So we have we have about 5 minutes left. So is there anything else in the conversation? Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your school or your practice, or anything else that wants to be said about how spirituality can, and I know for some people that word may or may not work. They may have some ideas of what that means, but maybe it's like a depth of authentic, being. How does anything else want to be said about that?
Well, I think just this ongoing conversation about really recognizing that every situation we're in is an opportunity for our healing, however we want to position it. And that if we're experiencing any kind of upset in our life, there is an opportunity for healing there. The trick is going in versus going out. And I think one place that we see this most often, and an area that I love to work, is in couples. And in a couple relationship, we're triggered a lot, and ultimately is the best opportunity for our spiritual growth. Not that we cannot heal not in relationship, and that within relationship we're given a multitude of opportunities. And to look at a relationship as an opportunity for healing, and to recognize our disagreements, our places where I get upset within my relationship, are also perfect. Thank you. This person is giving me the opportunity to heal through my experience with you. And that's another area that I really like to particularly work with, is couples, because we often think, oh, it's not working because we're not getting along, because of all these things that may be happening. And that may be true, but there's some other options we can look at before we make that decision.
Yeah, I love that. And what I'm reminded of, first in my personal story, because I lost everything when I was around 40. Everything, all of it. And I recognized at that moment that I was going to rebuild my life, and I had to make a decision. A fundamental decision. Was I going to build it from the inside out or from the outside in? And I knew that there was something very seductive about the way I'd done it before, and just knowing that that's not who I've come here to be. Yeah. And I just love the way you frame everything's an opportunity, because if no one hears anything else, it's what happens when I decide that it's all for me. Yeah. So I would like to invite you back to continue this conversation next week. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about couples, or we'll see what emerges. But I'm so grateful that we've been in this conversation. And
I'd love to.
I just love you and love your work. And in closing, why don't you take a couple minutes to tell people how to find you, maybe your web information?
Sure.
Because, and I want to say before you do this, and I mean this, I have seen you do the most incredible, powerful work. And I know that what I love about you is that there's just absolute presence. And because you have a fundamental knowing that it's all useful, then whatever they show up with is useful. There's nothing to fix. Just let's be with this and see what comes up. So that's my plug for seeing the work that you've done. So if you could tell people how to find you, that'd be great.
I appreciate that, and it means a lot coming from you, and I've loved the work we've done together. And if you're interested and would like more information, you can look at my website, which is Kim, K-I-M, Kokoska, Kokoska.com. And all my contact information's there, email. So if you have any other questions or you want to reach out, that's the best way to get to me.
Great. Well, thank you again so much, Kim, for being on the show. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in and really being in conversation about what is wanted and needed now in the 21st century. And I want to say a little piece, in closing about that, because I have been asked a lot lately, it seems. I'm about to publish my first book, and Awakened Living is now growing, and we have a larger gathering every Sunday morning. And people are really interested in what is awakened living and what is spirituality and what does all this mean. And what has been showing up is this idea that I am viewing the world through a particular lens or a point of view. And what happens when I look at it through a lens of spirituality? And what that means to me is the lens of spirituality, that everything already is, I'm already whole and perfect. Nothing needs to change in the outer realm. It's all about the way I view it. And that's very different than what I think was wanted and needed in the 20th century, which seemed to be surrendering to some sort of power that was going to somehow fix or change my life. That maybe there was a belief that there was something wrong with me and I could surrender to a greater power that would make it right. Where I feel like we are in consciousness in the 21st century is really recognizing that we're all whole and perfect and complete. And this isn't about surrendering to something outside of us, but to expressing that more in the world. And so one more time, I want to thank Kim for being on the show, because I see Kim as someone who is living that, not only in her personal life, but also in her practice. So I invite all of you to really connect with Kim and have a session with her. I know that anytime I'm going through something, she's one of the first people I want to go to. Even in 15 minutes, it's like, oh yeah, this is really something going on in me. And it's all good. It's all good. So thank you very much for tuning into our show. And I want to invite you also to join us at Awakened Living for an upcoming event. You can find us online at awakenedlivingsf.org. Thank you so much, and good night.